I'm going to walk you through how to do the Civil War myths portion of our Civil War student packet. You'll often find it towards the front. On this version, it's on page 6 on the bottom of the Civil War cause and effects. Using the in-class notes in the space below, cite 3 myths. Myths are often ways to explain something. Typically, it's a supernatural phenomenon, such as if I wanted to invent a reason as to why all my ice cream was disappearing, I might say it's because the elves in my freezer come out when I'm asleep and they attack all my ice cream and they use it to build forts and water slides as it slowly melts. But in reality, it's just because I'm eating it. Cite 3 myths that most Americans have of the Civil War, and then provide 2 reasons as to why it's a myth. In the way that we're doing this, we have our 3 here. Thousands of, here we go. Start number 1. I lost my mouse. The North went to war to end slavery, and then we provide 2 reasons why it's false. Thousands of African Americans fought for the Confederacy. We provide 2 reasons why it's false. And the third, slavery was on its way out, which means it was going to end anyway. And we provide 2 reasons as to why this is false. My lights just popped on for my plant. It's time for me to turn on these lights too. As we are going through, I'm going to do this off of our reading by James Lowen. James Lowen is a doctor, and he is quite the Civil War expert. He's done a lot of research in regarding the American Civil War and is seen as one of the greatest leaders in that. If you want to learn more about him, you can go ahead and click this link here. We'll close that out, and this is James Lowen. He says several books. He taught race relations in Mississippi. These are all of his articles. He's done quite a lot. I've added some things in italics. I've tried to make them blue. I might not have made all of them blue, but we'll figure it out and go through it together. So myth number 1, the North went to war to end slavery. You'll see that I'm working right here. And as I'm reading, I'll be listening for 2 reasons as to why that might be false. Number 1, the South went to war to end slavery. I want to see if I can make, at least this will allow for a way to see maybe where I'm at. There we go. We can at least see the mouse here a little bit better. The South definitely went to war to preserve slavery. Preserve is to keep. But did the North go to war to end slavery? No. The North went to war initially to hold the nation together. Abolition, which means to end slavery, that's the italics, that's in blue, that's what I've added, came later. On August 22nd, 1862, President Lincoln wrote a letter to Horace Greeley, who was an abolitionist editor of the New York Tribune. That's a newspaper. And Lincoln had stated, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it, meaning the Union, the country, by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save the country by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear, or not do, forget, I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Lincoln's own anti-slavery beliefs were widely known at the time, indeed so widely known that it helped prompt the southern states to rebel. In the same letter, Lincoln wrote, I have here stated my purpose according to my view of the official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. So in the letter, Lincoln has already said, and here's the italicized, this is a translation, it's a little bit easier to understand of what Lincoln wrote. Lincoln said, I already shared what I'm doing this job, and I believe what I should do. I really want everyone everywhere to be free, and that's something I've talked a lot about. Lincoln was concerned, rightly, that making the war about freeing the enslaved would anger Northern Unionists, many of whom cared little about the African Americans. But by late 1862, it became clear that ending slavery in the rebelling states could help the war effort. The war itself started the emancipation, which is when you're freed or something is let go. If I emancipate my ice cream, I'm letting it go off into the wild. The war itself started the emancipation, the freeing of the slaves, the process. Whenever U.S. forces drew near, African Americans flocked to their lines, the lines of the army, to help the war effort, to make a living, and most of all, to simply be free. Some of Lincoln's generals helped him to see that early on, sending those same individuals who came back to slavery would only help the Confederate cause. A month after issuing his letter to the New York Tribune, which was a newspaper, Lincoln combined official duty and private wish by announcing the Emancipation Proclamation to take effect on January 1st, 1863. And we'll study that on a different day and on a different page. So, myth number one, what could I put down? Well, on this one, I think that right off the bat here, Lincoln didn't go to war to free the slaves. He says that right here. He could, if he would save the country, he would do it by freeing the slaves. If he could save it by freeing any, he would. And he says right here, right above my line, if I could save the country without freeing any slave, he'd do it. So slavery wasn't as big of an issue to Lincoln as it was saving the country. That doesn't mean that Lincoln didn't care about that. He tells us right here that he's always cared about freeing the slaves. And that's something that he's talked a lot about. So while Lincoln as a person did want to free the slaves, Lincoln as a president wanted to keep the country together more than anything else. Perhaps that's one of my reasons. Myth number two. So then I go back to myth number two, and remember, I've provided one if you care to take it. You find another. And here's myth number two. Thousands of African Americans, both free and slave, fought for the Confederacy. Neo-Confederates, which are people who are bringing back the Confederate cause and people who are seen as bringing out segregation within the country today. Neo-Confederates have been making this argument since around the 1980s, but the idea is false. One reason that we know it's false is Confederate policy flatly did not let blacks become soldiers until March of 1865, towards the very end of the war. White officers did bring slaves to the front where they were pressed, which is forced. They're forced into service, doing laundry and cooking. Some Confederate leaders tried to enlist African Americans. In January 1864, towards the end of the war, Confederate General Patrick Cleburne proposed filling the ranks with black men. One of the reasons he did this was because the Confederates were losing so many people, they needed to get more soldiers. When Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. He's Lincoln's counterpart in the South. When Jefferson Davis heard the suggestion, he rejected the idea and ordered that the subject be dropped and never discussed again. But the idea wouldn't die. In the war's closing weeks, General Robert E. Lee was desperate for men. He asked the Confederate government to allow enslaved men to serve in exchange for some post-war freedom. This time the government gave in, but few blacks signed up, and soon the war was over. So, myth, thousands of African Americans freed and enslaved fought for the Confederacy. Why is it false? Well, right here. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, said no, he wouldn't allow it. There was a change in the closing weeks, and my box is a little bit too small there. So one reason is the president said no. There was a change here where General Robert E. Lee tried to get more soldiers. However, by the time that happened, nobody was going to fight for the Confederacy. They had seen the writing on the wall, as well as why would you trust somebody who's offering you freedom after the war when everything up into the war gave you reasons not to trust them? Myth number two. And now my third myth. Slavery was on its way out anyway, which means it was almost done. So whether or not the Civil War would have happened, slavery would have stopped. That's the myth. Number three. Slavery was hardly on its last legs in 1860. That year, the South produced almost 75% of all U.S. exports. And we know that word from BizTown and from our economies part, but that means that the southern states, the ones that we've mapped, that's driving 75% of the economy. Slaves were valued at being worth more than all the manufacturing companies and the railroads in the nation. No elite class, so rich people, No elite class in history have ever given up such an immense interest voluntarily. True, several European colonies in the Caribbean had ended slavery. Britain had ended it a few years before, but that action was taken by the mother country. Like Britain was in charge of some of those Caribbean countries, such as Jamaica. So Jamaica outlawed slavery, but that was because Britain had outlawed slavery. To claim that the U.S. slavery would have ended on its own is impossible to disprove, but very hard to support. So that line means I can't prove that I don't have the ability to fly, but it's very hard for me to prove that I can fly. In 1860, slavery was growing more entrenched, more focused in the South. Unpaid labor made for big profits, and Southern elite was growing even richer. Slavery's return on investment essentially crowded out the other economic development and left the South as an agricultural society, meaning that people who were running the plantations were getting more money by having enslaved workers than if they paid their workers. So there wasn't a motivation for the people who were enslaving others to stop. Freeing slaves was becoming more and more difficult for the owners, as state after state required them to transport freed slaves beyond the state boundaries. For the foreseeable future, slavery looked secure. That was myth 3. Find your 2 reasons. You'll notice I didn't give clear answers on that one because we had in these prior ones, myth 1 and myth 2. For myth 3, I know you can do that.